Public hate. This is a hot dog to be public hate. Just the music must be public hate. Holy hope, public hate. Somebody get a rush man dog.
All right, my friends, welcome to the Weekend Interview Show. It's December 17th, 2005. And we got a great show lined up for you today. First up will be Christopher Deliso from bulkanalysis.com. And in the second hour, Ron Paul will be joining us, and we may or may not have Gordon Prather on for half an hour before Ron Paul, depending on whether Dr. Paul can do the whole hour, which we are yet to find out for sure. But we definitely have a great show lined up for you today. I'm Scott Horton. My website is weekendinterviewshow.com. Although I also ought to go ahead and give you the new domain name for my new blog, although I don't think it's quite operative yet. The blog is, but the domain name isn't. But it will be very soon, probably by the time most of y'all hear this, thestressblog.com. And myself and Anthony Gregory and a couple of my Australian friends, Tim Gillen and Luke Ryland, are also blogging there, along with Brandon Snyder from antiwar.com. Who's my webmaster as well. So all the archives are at weekendinterviewshow.com in MP3 format for you. And the new blog is thestressblog.com. Also want to remind you real quickly that at 8 o'clock Texas time, 9 o'clock Eastern tonight, Karen Katowski's show American Forum will be here on RBN, and her guest tonight will be Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, the guy that used to brief George Bush Sr. when he was the vice president back in the day. He's the founder of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and he will be on Karen Katowski's show American Forum tonight. That's 9 o'clock Eastern time. And now, before I bring on the first guest today, I kind of want to just sort of give a broad outline of where we're going, at least in the first half of this interview, in discussing what Larry Wilkerson, Colin Powell's former deputy, calls the Cheney neocon cabal. And Justin Raimondo at antiwar.com calls it neocon gate, all the different scandals. It's not just Scooter Libby and the leaking of Valerie Plame's name, but we also have the Office of Special Plans, where they lied us into war. We have the Niger uranium forgeries. We have the neoconservatives' connections to Ahmed Chalabi, who turns out was a spy for Iran. Of course, the leaking of the name of Valerie Plame and the outing of her CIA front organization, Brewster Jennings. We have Larry Franklin, the Israeli spy who worked in the Office of Special Plans, and the Sibel Edmonds case, which seems to perhaps be the jigsaw puzzle piece that really ties all these things together. And hopefully you guys are familiar with some of these names, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you who are the actual neoconservatives in this administration, particularly in the first term, although most of them have been held over. First of all, Paul Wolfowitz was the Deputy Secretary of Defense. He's now the head of the World Bank. And the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy under him was a guy named Douglas Feith. He's now been replaced by Eric Edelman. Scooter Libby, of course, was Cheney's chief of staff, was indicted. John Hanna held various roles in the State Department and in the Vice President's office. Stephen Hadley was the Deputy National Security Advisor, is now the National Security Advisor of the United States. David Addington was one of Scooter Libby's deputies, has now moved to replace Scooter Libby as Chief of Staff to the Vice President. David Wurmser, also from the Vice President's office and also at the State Department for a time, where he was acting as a leash on Colin Powell. Larry Franklin, of course, the man who's pled guilty to passing secrets to Israel. Elliot Abrams. There's a guy named Mark Grossman, who we're going to be learning about quite a bit today. And don't let me leave out Bill Ludy and Abram Shulsky, the guys who ran the Office of Special Plans for Douglas Feith, who lied us into war. Now, John Bolton is often confused for a neoconservative because he's so close to them and he's part of AEI, but he's actually not an ex-Trotskyite like the rest of these guys, but is in fact just a typical right-wing military-industrial complex type. And there are a couple other lesser neocons. There's a guy named Flitz we're going to be learning about today, and also, Harold Rode, don't let me forget him, Chalabi's guy. So anyway, this is the neocon cabal, and this is what the subject of today's show. Christopher Deliso from Bulk Analysis and antiwar.com right after this break.
Don't take your guns to town.
right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm your host, Scott Horton. And first guest today is Christopher Deliso from live on the phone from Skopje, Macedonia. Skopje.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I was not... Jerry makes the Y sound. I knew I was going to screw it up. That's all right. From the capital city of Macedonia, however you pronounce it, right?
How are you?
I'm doing great. Welcome to the show. And everyone, you can read what Christopher Deliso writes at bulkanalysis.com and also, of course, for antiwar.com. And, I think in my opening rant, I might have left out Elliot Abrams. He's a neocon.
Oh, you said Elliot Abrams.
Oh, did I get Abrams in there?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Making sure. So here we have this neocon gate, Christopher, and we have the Office of Special Plans, we have the Niger forgeries, we have Ahmed Chalabi, we got Larry Franklin, and we have, obviously, the outing of the CIA agent Valerie Plame. And maybe I'm going out on a limb here. I don't know how much we really know at this point. I'm sure you probably understand it a lot better than I do. But it seems to me as though the Sibel Edmonds story, the fired FBI translator, whistleblower, that she is the jigsaw puzzle piece that kind of ties all this stuff together. What do you think?
Well, I'd say, yeah, there's definitely a connection. When you say jigsaw puzzle piece, it's perhaps only because we know less about her story because, she's under this gag order. So perhaps if she had been allowed to say her bit in 2002 or 2003 or up to now, it would all make sense, or perhaps there's another person that, we don't know about. But because of her not being able to speak, this is what makes it fascinating, I guess, for people like me who like to sort of put the puzzle together and to look for all the hidden details. That's what I enjoy about it, actually. It's a kind of mental exercise. But it is also very important.
Well, and we do know some things about Sibel Edmonds, and I think you and I are probably in competition for who's interviewed her the most times at this point. But surely yours are the more informative of the interviews, no doubt about that, because, frankly, you know which questions to ask that hadn't occurred to me. When I hear her say, well, there seems to be sort of something or other going on at the American-Turkish Council, you really kind of know, you seem to know where to pick that up and run with it, where I really don't know what to say.
I don't know. I just take it on instinct, basically, but also having the background of being in Europe and having lived in Turkey and spent time in all these areas, maybe I see some connection from the other end, not just from America. So that's helpful also.
Now, you've written... I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, continue.
Well, I was just going to say, you've written these two articles for antiwar.com recently, Lesser Neocons of La Farid Plame and Plame Pakistan, a Nuclear Turkey, and the Neocons. And these two articles together, especially if you take into account my last interview with Sibel Edmonds, I think really we begin to see where these ties all come together. When I interviewed Sibel last, it was right after the Vanity Fair piece came out about her, An Inconvenient Patriot. And in that article, it described over and over again unnamed State Department and Defense Department officials. And I asked her, wow, that's funny because that's the same phrase I keep finding over and over again in the Larry Franklin indictment and Steve Rosen and Keith Weissman. I wonder if these two scandals are connected. And she said, yes, absolutely, they are connected. And that, I guess, her best guess would be that those are the very same unnamed Defense and State Department officials. And I actually ended up guessing wrong from that angle. I was thinking more of the Israel connection. But she emphasized the Turkic countries, which I guess means kind of the whole route through Central Asia, right? From Turkey through the Stands.
More or less. Yeah, and Azerbaijan as well. And so I don't know where to start with this. I guess really if one thing that she said is that the investigation, the FBI investigation that she is taking part in, had been ongoing from, I believe, 1997, as far back as that. Quite a long time, yes.
So,
and I think another important thing to notice just at the beginning is what she's always told me, that these indiscretions or these corruption and crime did not involve the current Turkish government. She made that clear to me that it was investigating previous administrations, and the government changed a couple of years ago. Now, on the other hand, she's been out of work since 2002, so who knows what is the situation now. But based on what she said, and we're going on the facts, and on her experience working for the FBI. But still, from that, even only a short few months, she apparently heard a lot of stuff and was tasked with going back over the translations that her colleague Jan Mellick Dickerson had not. And from this, we can learn a lot of things. And you were saying about the ties between the various neocon-gate scandals. I think you have the same group of officials popping up in every case because they have a lot of experience as being lobbyists for Israel, for Turkey, for Pakistan, for countries like this, going back to the Reagan administration, going back to George Bush Sr. And in the Clinton years, they were out of power, but they by no means were they out of the game. They were still profiting in private lobbying companies, and at places like the American Enterprise Institute, they were making their own plans and grandiose visions for what should happen in the world and invasions of Iraq and Syria and things like this. So this is, for these people, this has been a pretty consistent, active pursuit.
And it reminds me now, which neocon in the administration's name I forgot, and that's, of course, Richard Pearl, the 800-pound gorilla.
The big daddy.
Yeah, exactly. And now he's the one who, he and Douglas Feith, had set up this group called the International Advisors Incorporated.
Yes, and Sibel made that very clear that that's, to trace it all the way back to that particular organization.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay, and now...
So that's when they started working for $800,000 a year representing the government of Turkey.
Right, and they had to register as representatives of a foreign government at that time, right?
Yes, yes. And I think the average for the next 4 years was $600,000 a year. This is from an article by James Zogby in 2000, I believe. Fake started in 1989 as a foreign agent representing the government of Turkey. And this was, quote, to promote the objective of U.S.-Turkish defense industrial cooperation. And Richard Pearl was its highest-paid external consultant, even though he wasn't very external, in the same way that being the head of the Defense Policy Board, as Seymour Hersh was discussing in that famous article, Lunch with the Chairman, a couple of years ago. He was pretty much working the inside.
Right, that was about Trireme Partners, right?
Yes, and the Saudis.
So basically what's going on here is Pearl and Feith, they're International Advisors Incorporated. They basically represent, or their job basically was lubricating deals for military-industrial complex purposes.
Military-industrial complex.
Right.
And, you can't just set up shop as a lobbyist, and if you're nobody, and expect that they're going to give you this money to do this. You have to have connections. And at that time, the Wall Street Journal report, which Pearl got irate about, as usual, when someone criticizes him, was that, among other things, he had supervised U.S. military assistance to Turkey during his recent 7-year hitch in the Pentagon. That was a contemporary article. So he had been, since the early 80s, supervising all of the military contracting that took place in the Reagan administration. So this is the same bunch of people. They're doing the same job. This should not come as a surprise to any American or any foreign reader.
Well,
if you just do a little bit of research on the internet, you can see this is just business as usual.
Although I think the shocking part really here, Christopher, is that when you talk about some guy who's a high level at the DoD, he goes through the revolving door, he gets a job as a consultant for a giant company, and they pay him $1 billion a year because it's all tax money and paybacks and that kind of thing. That kind of typical corruption, I think most Americans accept almost willingly. But the shocking part here, I think, is Sibel Edmonds is talking about nuclear black market smuggling, financing of terrorism, money laundering, smuggling heroin, running guns. We're talking about serious criminal activity, and if we can, and again, she's under gag order and has not been able to come right out and level the accusations where it seems like she would like to, but it seems like she's implying that these very same guys, International Advisors, Inc., etc., Pearl and his friends are involved in these international crime rings. Am I jumping too far to conclusions here?
Well, I honestly cannot say this with any fact. I'm not going to accuse any individual of doing anything, because it's very hard to prove. And even if you recall, the Vanity Fair article was mentioning that Dennis Hastert allegedly took a bribe to quash the resolution about the Armenian genocide in 2000. And even with that, he just laughed it off. He said next thing they will do, they say I broke up Brad Pitt's relationship or something. So if someone can go to those lengths and come up with such a solid story and they can just laugh it off, there's really nothing that you can do except try to educate people.
Right, and that's really where we're at here, is that this scandal...
And you have to work with hypotheticals, because you have to be very patient. If you don't know something as a fact, and you can't say, you can't overstate your case, or else it ruins your case, basically.
Sure, yeah.
You just have to think, and this is why working with Sibel's story is very instructive, because you have to think, okay, if you were such an official in such a position, who would you have access to? If you can't just come out and say, if she can't just come out and say these things.
Right.
What would your daily routine entail? What kind of companies would you be working with? And this is why the people that she has mentioned, the three of them being Faith, Pearl, and Grossman, it's very interesting to watch their connections, because if you were the kind of people who could do such a thing, these would be the kind of people who could.
All right, everybody. We're talking with Christopher Deliso from antiwar.com and bulkanalysis.com. We'll be right back. All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm your host, Scott Horton. I'm talking with Christopher Deliso from bulkanalysis.com and antiwar.com, live from Skopje, Macedonia. Did I pronounce it right that time? All right. Okay, so now here's the funny thing about all this. It turns out that Joe Wilson met Valerie Plame at the American-Turkish Council, where she presumably was there operating undercover for the CIA. And I've learned from... I believe your third to last article for antiwar.com, Plame Pakistan and Nuclear Turkey and the neocons, or maybe it was lesser neocons of L'Affaire de Plame, I forget. In one of those two articles, you say that that Sibel Edmonds has confirmed to you explicitly, or at least when you laid it out or something, that Brewster Jennings, in fact, was heavily involved with investigating nuclear black market activities in Turkey, and even to the specificity of the involvement of Mark Grossman and others. Isn't that right?
Yes, but no firm details. But I can say generally they were involved with that country, yes. And this was also from Turkish newspaper articles and other sources that confirm this. Okay, now, there's been various ideas about why they leaked Valerie Plame's name. It seemed like such overkill just to embarrass Joe Wilson, and people are saying, well, maybe they were really trying to out Brewster Jennings and Associates. The CIA, apparently, according to Larissa Alexandrovna last week, the center of the CIA's counter-proliferation efforts. Yeah, I think that's one of the more plausible, scenarios, and one of the more plausible motives for why they would want to effectively shut her down, because if it was just, they were just angry with Wilson, they could have done any number of different things that didn't involve his wife. Why the wife? That is, the central question. Right. And now, interesting, Wilson doesn't act like he thinks that this is about anything other than embarrassing him. But then again, maybe he's out of the loop. Well, I have no way of knowing what what he's trying. Maybe he has his own goals, what he's trying to do with this, and maybe the story, maybe the story's not finished yet. Right. Maybe we will find out many other things soon. But you were mentioning about how these characters might all be related with, black market things, and I could say a little bit about that. You can go from conventional lobbying. You said maybe it's not so controversial. We would expect as citizens that the officials would take a lot of money and move along Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or whoever, Boeing, to foreign suppliers. But you had Seymour Hersh's article from 1993, which I make use of in my article about the Turkish-Pakistan claim, Pakistan and nuclear Turkey and the neocons, that article, where he's talking about the George Bush Sr. and Reagan administrations sort of turning a blind eye as Pakistan armed itself with nuclear weapons and arms race against arch rival India. And it was also confirmed that they received technology and help from different labs and workshops in Turkey, among other places. And there was a point in, I think, the 80s and 90s when the two governments were a bit more Islamist in nature, and they saw benefit in both of them being nuclear armed. To this date, only we know that Pakistan is. But the rub with the Richard Pearl and Dick Cheney was the Secretary of Defense then, was that there was laws in Congress against giving military help to developing nations that were working on nuclear programs. And they found that the fighter planes that they were sending were going to be retrofitted to launch nuclear missiles, presumably for a war against India. And they realized that this would scupper the deal. And in order to save the deal, they had to bury this, and they had to get rid of an earlier version of Sibel Edmonds, an agent named Richard Barlow, who was very interested in this subject and had proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Pakistan was developing nuclear weapons as technology. So there you have this convergence. You have the regular lobbyists and officials who want to make money selling the fighter jets, which is, legitimate, allegedly. But they're willing to turn a blind eye as people like A.Q. Khan, who is the father of the Pakistani bomb, are doing their work. And with the help of companies that they know, that the government knows is illegal. And these are the companies that Brewster Jennings was focusing on. And nevertheless, they were allowed to continue so that the major deals and the major foreign relations can continue.
And this really makes sense in the larger context of the war taking place between the CIA and the neocons in the Vice President's office and the Pentagon.
Yeah, and even within those agencies, because you have people like Frederick Fleets, who was on loan to Bolton from the CIA. So he was sort of the neocons mole within the counter-proliferation group that Valerie Plame was part of. And here he is with his clearances to go there and see what's happening, and he's reporting back to the neocons.
Right,
as a central figure in the leak.
Right, and also, as you mentioned in your article, this guy Grossman was working with General Mahmoud Ahmed, the guy that paid $100,000 to Muhammad Atta.
Yeah, a few days before September 11th.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of turning a blind eye. All right, everybody, we'll be right back with Christopher Deliso from BalkAnalysis.com. It's the Weekend Interview Show. Friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm your host, Scott Horton. I'm talking with Christopher Deliso from BalkAnalysis.com and, of course, Antiwar.com. And I have good and bad news for you. First, the bad news. Gordon Prather will not be joining us half an hour from now because of the good news, which is that Dr. Ron Paul will be able to join us for, looks like, the entire hour, depending on when the leadership calls for the next vote on the House floor. He's up there in Washington, D.C., working hard to protect your liberty from the other 434 members of the House of Representatives. Okay, now, Christopher, I really want to talk with you all about Kosovo and Macedonia and what's going on in the Balkans, because I barely have any idea, and I know my audience is way behind. We all are. TV doesn't really tell us much. But before we go there, it's into that subject, I just want to hit you up for what am I missing about this neocon gate? There's something here that there's some blatant point that must be stated that I'm not catching. And I wonder if you know what it is.
I don't exactly know how I don't exactly follow what.
Well, it just seems like, there's got to be some new ground that we can get covered here. I mean, where we left the break, for example, was the Mohammed Atta's financier meeting with Mark Grossman just a couple of days before the attacks.
Well, perhaps the best way that I can help you is with the international connection. I think the people who are researching these issues have to start looking a little bit more internationally at the links. Because after all, you're talking about officials who, like Grossman, who worked in Pakistan, who worked in Turkey, who worked for NATO in Europe, who spend a lot of their time abroad and in the service of as lobbyists or as diplomats in foreign countries, So you have to look, since the nuclear and the drugs is all a global game, you have to look at the connections. And I think people don't make enough Euro ties, as I would say. That you think the Europeans, I think there's a stereotype, are the wimps or the good guys. The European Union is this benevolent force. But nevertheless, you have all of these countries have very large, if quiet, roots as conduits, between businesses. You have, for example, the one that Sibel Edmonds mentions that the Los Angeles Times mentioned in 2004, Giza Technologies from New Jersey on the port, one of the ports that she mentioned for shipments coming in and out. And they're supplying hard-to-find parts like switches and oscillators and things that most people can't find that you can use for various kind of dual-use purposes. And they have branches in Spain and South Africa and all over the place. And you sort of see the connection with the legitimate and the semi-legitimate when you look in the kind of contracts that such companies do. Because most of them are above board and legitimate. They're working on major defense contracting things for European Union countries, but also in some illegitimate capacities. So you think your elected officials or your appointed officials who are working either as lobbyists or as diplomats will come across the full run of the companies and all the defense programs, and they will know who is arming who and how, and they will be connected with these organizations and have a pretty good idea of what's going on. People overlook countries like Cyprus, which, if you look on the map, is perfectly situated in the pocket there under Turkey, near Syria, near Israel. Countries that have very highly advanced banking systems. It's not just Switzerland. Countries like Cyprus have very highly advanced banking systems, and half of it's controlled by the Russians now. There's a lot of Russian investment there. And all of these, our politicians, their politicians, are all very well connected, very friendly amongst each other.
And, Loretta Napoleoni, the Italian journalist, author of the book Terror Incorporated, she basically talks a lot about, well, first of all, she says that if we were to destroy all the terrorist economy on Earth, that the whole world economy would collapse. It's trillions of dollars a year. It's major amounts of, again, black market, liquid money, unregulated money floating around. And almost all of it, it seems, hinges on selling heroin to Europeans. And this market of opium products from Afghanistan through Uzbekistan and all that kind of route westward into Turkey. And then I guess Turkey's really the main kind of transfer center point
sure, and
to Europe
that's
and
how
America.
You get here to the Balkans and to the west through Turkey, through truckloads, through Bulgaria, through Serbia, through Kosovo, through a little bit through Macedonia. And, I've had other interests from journalists and documentary teams here in Europe who are very interested in that angle and how that funds things. This is something that helped fund the wars in Kosovo and in Macedonia because many Albanians are part of that trade in coalition with the Turkish or Serbian mafias or Russians in bringing heroin into Europe and then on to America.
Right.
It's coming in a straight line, like you said, from Central Asia through Turkey, through the Balkans.
And then, so this really is, the story of Kosovo is really just another branch off of the same story then, really, because you have somewhat interconnections between the same terrorist groups operating in Kosovo, the same ones that our guys apparently are turning a blind eye to when they're selling nuclear technology and drugs and anything else.
Well, Kosovo is basically one large organized crime piece of territory, basically, they use various nationalistic political slogans because that sells very well with the people, and you can sort of keep them on a leash. But it's a big business area, and they found sophisticated ways of diverting cash and diverting operations. And you go down the road and you wonder, didn't I just see a gas station 2 miles ago? It is the biggest concentration of gas stations and neon light motels anywhere in the world, I think. It's extraordinary. It's really extraordinary. And now that you've had the international presence there for the last 6 years since NATO bombed Serbia and kicked the Serbian army and police out, there's been a whole plethora of new organizations which are very good for money laundering. And you had a lot of charities, many Islamic charities that were most of them were shut down after September 11th, but some of them were allowed to continue. And the United Nations mission in Kosovo, we call it UNMIK, tries to hush these things up when somebody speaks out about it. The whistleblower Tom Gamble used to work for the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and he was reprimanded several times when he would meet with high-level U.S. and UN military and diplomats and tell them, look, we have a problem here. People are photographing these banned Islamic groups that are operating in Kosovo, right under your nose. And it's like any institution. It's not just, the FBI or, the U.S. Any large institution, there's this institutional malaise of damage control to hush things up at all costs, which is why now 6 years on, it's a fairly consistent pattern. You would think to any, right-minded individual that the Albanians are pretty much out to remove the Serbian minority completely from Kosovo. You've had about 150 churches blown up or vandalized, and
now,
many
correct me if I'm wrong,
people removed.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the very opposite was the justification for that war in the first place, right? That the Serbs were trying to ethnically cleanse all the Albanians out of Kosovo.
Well, that's what they said, yeah. And, Bill Clinton is talking about 100,000 people killed and disappeared. And
have they had any better luck finding those mass graves than they've had finding the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq?
Of course not, but you see, the best way for the war state to continue is to just make another chaos and another spectacle somewhere else until you never have to answer the old questions. It just sort of replicates itself.
Hey, that's perfectly fair to say. I mean, honestly, I guess I interviewed Nabosh Malik 2 or 3 years ago, but at least since I've been on the Republic Network, you're the first person I've had on to talk about the Balkans at all. It's out of sight, out of mind. We talk about Iraq up here every week, but
completely forgotten scandals. And
okay.
As I've tried to report in the last few years, so many of these things that are unbelievable, but nobody has time to think of the news, what's happening now. If you read the paper, inundated with information, and you don't know where you are in the latest scandal and who people are trying to work and feed their families. And even if you're trying to be an informed citizen, unless you have a lot of extra time and a lot of zealousness, it's very hard to keep up on these things, which is why those of us who do this as a job have to try harder to bring this information to your attention. But the reason that I mentioned this about a pattern of violence against the Serbian minority is simply to address the kind of euphemisms and damage control that the UN mission is using. Every time that someone is murdered or another teenager is killed in a drive-by shooting or someone's house is burned down, it's called an isolated incident.
I'm absolutely shocked to hear you saying that the UN's not doing a great job of keeping peace there.
Shocked, I'm shocked, yes.
I thought I thought that baby blue flag meant world peace.
One would think, but the UN is even more insidious in a way because honestly, you know what it is. You have made up of this mission from all the different countries. You have people who, in the U.S., everyone has to go through their own State Department, and that's how they get in. But the U.S., the State Department is subcontracting to other groups, and then they're subcontracting to these military contracting, private mercenary companies who are filling people like this. You have everyone from small-town cops from Oklahoma to people who've worked in military intelligence who are retired and looking for some extra money, and people who are not particularly qualified for anything, who are just finding a high-paid international job. And you have these people, these career peacekeepers who go around the world looking for the next, zone of misery and carnage in order to have an inflated salary and to live it up in front of the locals. And in fairness to the Albanians, this is what sort of pissed them off from the beginning. Is many people there are very poor, and they were in war, and they suffered tremendously. And then you have these Americans or British or whoever coming in with salaries 100 times theirs, and they walk around like they own the place, and they're drunk all the time, and they take their women as girlfriends, and you can understand why the people would start to develop this resentment. And the reason why the UN has had to hush up everything is because they are completely, and they know they're completely vulnerable. Because if you go to work in a place like Kosovo, you have to have an apartment to stay in. You have to go out for dinner somewhere. You have to wash your clothes. You have to do all kinds of daily things.
So they're not trying to rock the boat.
Who are the people who own this? They're living at their mercy, basically. If you're the boss of the whole UN mission, your life can be in jeopardy whenever someone decides to pull the trigger. Which is why everything is politically motivated that happens. The former prime minister, the Albanian former guerrilla leader, Ramush Haradinaj, was indicted by The Hague, the War Crimes Tribunal in the Netherlands. And he was inexplicably released for good behavior in the spring and sent back to Kosovo, whereas elderly people like Milosevic are, deemed to be a flight risk or whatever, and they're kept there even though they're not really doing anything except pontificating. But Haradinaj was a potent political force, and it's fairly, conventional wisdom that he was released because he could keep the peace, or he could at least keep, he could have some influence over the local Albanians and keep them from killing the UN. And if you talk with them, of course, they'll say, no, the UN is our friend, we love America, all this and that. But in March of 2004, there were these massive riots, which, we later learned were completely managed by the Albanian mafia militant figures, which targeted the Serbian minority and destroyed 35 churches and drove thousands of people out of their home. And I was there, and I was interviewing these American UN policemen. And one of the guys was telling me, one day the angry mob is attacking him and throwing Molotov cocktails at them, and the next day he goes into the shop and there's the same guy, and he says, "Oh, my friend from America, you are great, I love you." And he says, "Well, you love me. Yesterday, you were trying to kill me." He says, "Oh no, this is not true. I saw in the news nothing happened like this." So there's this incredible collective hallucination, this collective psychosis going on. And so the UN is definitely afraid, and everything is politics. And this was extremely foreseeable, which is what is so tragic about it. The leaders like Blair and Clinton and Albright and Holbrooke, who envisioned this whole mess, knew that they would never have to live there. And in fairness to the people on the ground, who are basically just trying to save their own skin, which you or I would probably do in that situation, they have to deal with the mess that these politicians made. Clinton and Blair were just there kissing babies for one day after NATO invaded. But the honeymoon was over by the middle of 2001 when the Albanians saw that NATO actually was not their liberators, it was just another occupying force.
Well, and you've written, too, that the UN has appeased the Albanians for so long, and they're such at the mercy of the people they're supposedly ruling over or keeping the peace between or whatever it is, that they're basically helpless. You wrote one of your articles, I believe, was called "The UN's Last Winter in Kosovo." This whole place is a tinderbox. The Albanians are going to get their independence, whether NATO wants to give it to them or not. They already have given it to them de facto, and they're going to take the rest.
Well, it's a matter of time, but the thing the way it works in the Balkans is seasonally. This is not war season because it's, we had a very nice snowfall this evening. It was very pretty. But this means you can't go in the mountains and train like they're doing in the spring and the summer. So what I imagine will happen is there will be some, shows of displays of force, occasional UN car blown up here or there, some Serbs killed here or there. But that will just be to sort of keep the pressure on, because right now we're at this sort of end game with the final status talks for what will be the future of Kosovo. We're heading for a train wreck in a way, because the treaty that ended that was called Resolution 1244, UN Resolution 1244, and that envisaged the return of Serbian police to Kosovo, and it said that Kosovo was an integral part of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia.
Well, is that really what NATO intended? I mean, do they really think they could do that?
Well, that's what they had to do because the support for the war was plummeting so fast, and NATO was on the verge of breaking up over it, and they had to find a way to end it,
All right, everybody, we're talking with... Hold it right there,
the
Christopher. We'll be right back, everybody. So weekend interview show. Christopher Deliso on the line. My friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm talking with Christopher Deliso from bulkanalysis.com. If you were UPI, you'd plagiarize him too.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, well. So, okay, where we left off, UN Resolution 1244, which was basically the truce at the end of the Kosovo War in 1999, said that, okay, Kosovo's still part of Serbia, and one day it will have the Serb army and the Serb police forces in there, but for now we have to intervene to protect the Albanians.
Yeah, it was a humanitarian crisis. Right?
Yeah, right, the genocide that was taking place.
Yeah.
Only now, as you say, they never did find those mass graves. They're as elusive as Saddam's nuclear weapons program, apparently.
Well, and CNN was with the PSYOPs unit. This is another article I have in the war, doing the war preparation hand in glove, so you wouldn't expect anything less. And the mass media, just like Judith Miller now, was in with the government, pushing the line. So if that was the last you heard of it, there's no doubt that the precedent would be just that it was a humanitarian war fought for all the right reasons and everything.
Which I have to say I don't understand. Why is it that NATO and the U.S. particularly took the side of the Albanian Muslims against the Serbs?
Well, there's several different theses. One of them is that this was the good Muslims. We had the chance to show that we don't hate all Muslims, and since Albanians are Muslim, and we defend them, the same with the Bosnian Muslims, and this is, that's a bit cynical, but that's one of them. I think, though, that Clinton was quite clever in a way, because he was looking around Europe for who will be the next generation of American allies, and realizing that the Albanians have many historical grievances with many of their neighbors, and have been oppressed and are actually going to be numerically stronger in the coming years because of a higher birth rate than the neighboring Christian countries. He saw that this was a young, dynamic, up-and-coming race, and who also had many problems that the U.S. could solve, and he could make a very strongly pro-American force there. He just didn't consider all of the small details on the local level, because the politicians never consider the realities on the ground. They just consider the grand theme. But I think that's what Clinton was looking at strategically, and we've made a base called Camp Bondsteel, which is in the middle of Kosovo, huge. It even has a Burger King, I think, and various shops. And
yeah, they say you can see it from space, right?
Well, I know you can see it from the Macedonian border, yeah, so probably from space as well. But the thing with these...
Oh,
continue. No.
Well, I was just going to say, so what Clinton did basically was he created a base for, not that military base, but he created a base for Al-Qaeda, basically, or for Islamic militants, a safe zone for them, like Pakistan was in the 1980s.
Yeah,
now they have.
Obviously, there's different. It's a different place, different situation. And if you speak with any Albanian, they will say we are violently against radical Islam. We are peaceful, and by and large, they are. But when you have a place, you have to understand that until July, there was almost no passport controls. If you take a bus from Skopje to Pristina, capital of Kosovo, you will be met with one of these UN policemen on the border from various nationalities, as well as a local Kosovo cop. And they might ask for your passport, they might not. They might sort of look through everybody, and you have an identity card, this or that. And until recently, this problem wasn't corrected, meaning that anybody and his brother could end up in Kosovo, and many people did, and many shadowy organizations did. And now you have a real problem because there's a very porous zone between Albania and Bosnia connecting through Kosovo and the Sanjak region of Serbia and Montenegro, which ironically enough is exactly on the midpoint where the West, for whatever reason, wants to break up Serbia and Montenegro into two different countries.
That's it, Christopher. We're all out of time. Everybody check out bulkanalysis.com. We'll be right back.